Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode. Today we have with us Professor Butterfield. She's a Maria Boroff Professor of English at Yale University. She's also a professor in the Faculty of English, French, and Music. So her research focuses primarily on literatures and music of France and England from the 13th to 15th centuries. So, from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in English literature and French literature and culture and music, particularly in this time period from the 13th to 15th centuries. So, I know a lot of graduate students find it pretty difficult sometimes to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of kind of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what resonates, what or who resonates with you, and what led you to your own research?
Thank you very much for having me for a start, and for these really interesting question. I know many graduate students of mine have said, "Well, what's a great topic to to study?" And in some ways, if we go after the scientific model of research, then they very much say, "Well, this is the area to work in," and it's something connected with my research. But of course, I always try to make sure that the research topic is something that student feels personally engaged in, and wouldn't want them to just do something because it was there to be done, but rather that they had their own energy, motivation, passion for it. In my case, I'm afraid it's a kind of, not a very helpful answer, which is which is that I've always been interested in English and French literature and music. So I come from a musical family, and I was reading from a ridiculously early age, non-stop. And my mother was Swiss, in fact, Swiss Allemande, Swiss German, but was also multilingual. And so, but it was French. It was somehow that glamour of French, which has been, the French have achieved this over the centuries with everybody, and I was caught. So it was just a kind of natural, and I started thinking about Chaucer to begin with, and then got a little bit nervous because it seemed even then that everybody had written anything there was to say about Chaucer. But actually, the French angle, I suddenly realized there's this whole range of literature in French Middle Ages, which was vast and much bigger than English literature, which is relatively tiny, brilliant, but relatively tiny. And so I got so absorbed in that. And in fact, my first book was just on French and music, nothing to do with English literature at all. But I've kept up all three, with enormous interest. So that's my story.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think maybe tapping into interests that you've already had before could be a
Yeah,
really interesting way to figure out what you actually want to study. Because if
yeah,
there's an interest there already, then you're almost halfway there. You already have that initial kind of spark.
it's
Um,
true. Yeah.
Definitely. So you've written a brilliant chapter on lyric for the Cambridge Companion to Medieval Literature, 1100 to 1500. So for everyone listening, could you please give us a bit of background on medieval lyric poetry? In an article that we'll shortly speak about, that the critical notion of lyric as applied to medieval English literature is somewhat contorted. So it's a bit of a complicated topic. So what is medieval lyric, and what are some of the form's most noticeable characteristics? And why is its conception as a genre or form slightly complicated, potentially, if at all?
Well, I've just finished, I can't believe I'm saying this, a very long project editing medieval English lyrics. Um,
Wow.
and so I've just finished writing the introduction to it, in which I've tried to address exactly this. And in a way, it's fascinating because most people think medieval English literature doesn't really have a lot to do with lyric as we think of it now. It's too religious, it's too solemn. People think it's diffuse, it's different. It's not got that obsession with the self, with subjectivity. That's what people think. It's not necessarily brilliantly concise in the way that post-romantic and romantic and post-romantic poetry has traditionally been. seen to be lyric. But actually, it's a story also about other languages, because if you go back to French at the time, you couldn't get a more clear and brilliant and seductive notion of lyric. Because partly because there are these beautiful chansonnier songbooks that survived from the 13th century and 14th century onwards, and there are many copies into Italy as well. And they are beautiful. They are full of illustrations. They have music. They have they're anthologies which have been carefully chosen. They're very socially conscious, and you just open one and you know exactly what a lyric is. And they even have wonderful little commentaries, blurbs, if you like, about the lyric authors, telling you stories about how they fell in love with this extraordinary princess or, woman. And there's this little narrative to read before you read your lyric. Now, nothing like that survives in English. No manuscripts like that. So actually, there's a kind of contradiction there. So lyric couldn't be clearer in French and German and Italian, but it's absolutely not clear in English. And so that's one thing that's until later, until much later. And that's something that one has to negotiate. And in fact, histories of English, of lyric, often just leap over the English Middle Ages altogether. They go from Sappho, this always makes you laugh, Greek woman, very attractive, very seductive, to, where? I mean, Petrarch, who's Italian, and then, Shakespeare, different kind of lyricist, but, and then we leap into the 19th century. So there's a kind of understandable reasoning, not reasoning, but assumption there. But I'm trying to kind of point people to the fascinations, if you like, of what is lyric then in English in the Middle Ages. And it's so really my anthology is doing this strange thing of questioning the notion of lyric as much as, allegedly presenting an anthology of medieval English lyric. So what I'm doing is I'm presenting something that people have to think, well, what is lyric exactly? And interestingly enough, this is exactly what people are doing now. So it has enormous links with contemporary writing. And what we're doing now is saying, well, lyric, actually, if you ask a student what is lyric, they will immediately think of lyrics, to the music. What are the lyrics? And no one is thinking about lyric as this high art thing. They're thinking of it as something, words that accompany music. And so again, that's something I'm bringing back because I'm saying music survives through all of this. It doesn't fit with the romantic notion of lyric at all, which is all about words. But actually, medieval lyric is there's so much music in the air. So how again we can think about lyric in these new ways, but also strangely very contemporary ways. One more thing, which is that people are also re-examining this high art notion of lyric, right, and high art literature, and saying, well, many of my colleagues at Yale are doing extraordinary work. African American colleagues are doing extraordinary work on song, which is part of tradition even in now in America, but also in the 20th century and earlier, where lyric song is not something that is written down. It's often, hugely popular, but performed by women who are not necessarily, they're not trained in high art English literature. But it's very widespread. It's fantastic. It's full of citation, full of, connections with a real social public that is kind of, in a different version. And so notions like high art are being really questioned in our modern universities and modern English departments as well, where people are thinking of English literature in kind of non-canonic ways. So I feel medieval literature is really part of that conversation. Quite unexpectedly, my African American colleagues say, "Oh, we have so much in common when we're thinking about some of these things." I say, "Yes, we do," unexpectedly. So I have much to learn from them, and they also from the kind of work that I'm doing. Yeah.
That's amazing. So it sounds like it's a quite a kind of a genre that has its kind of hands in like a lot of different buckets, if you will. It's quite
Yes.
almost like the preconceptions have to be kind of deconstructed to
Yes.
get to the very bottom of what actually is this form in a way.
Right, right, right.
Very interesting.
And of course, the other thing to understand is that the notion of lyric, of course, does change in different periods. So the idea that we now have the only definition that counts, is not, it's just not a good way of understanding literary history. But also, yes, questioning how much our notions of literature are post-romantic. We can break free from those if we want to. We don't have to, but it's good to kind of start questioning and thinking, why do I think like this? Yeah.
Definitely. I think sometimes we just take for granted our ways of thinking, but we have to kind of understand that they're a product of our time, no matter if we're living here, in the present day, or 100 years ago, or 500 years ago. Our
Exactly.
beliefs will change as a result of living in that time period, 100%. And that extends to conceptions of literature and criticism and genre. Um,
Yes.
Definitely.
Definitely,
Um,
and also, but I should just emphasize that mine is not a negative approach. It's not about saying don't think about lyric like this, think about it like this. It's more these are extra and plural ways of thinking about lyric, and we can enrich how we think if we think in these extra ways. So that's very much my approach. I'm not here to be dogmatic about lyric or about what is not lyric. Yeah.
No, definitely. It also seems like it's potentially there are more things that lyric is than it is not, potentially, from the way that
Right.
we're discussing it. Um,
Exactly.
so you write in a wonderful article, which I was referencing earlier, from ELH, Essays from the English Institute, and this article is entitled "Why Medieval Lyric?" So in this article, you discuss how it can sometimes be quite tricky, as we're discussing, to identify a lyric and to kind of pinpoint whether or not something may be a lyric. So you draw on Virginia Jackson's engagement with Emily Dickinson, and you examine the importance of reading practices in the formation of a text's formal identity, so to speak. You write, quote, "The modern lyric came into being when readers decided they wanted to read poems as lyrics." So again, there's that notion of the reader being consciously engaged in the formation of identity for a piece. So how can we think then about this relationship between the reader, the text, and the text form? Might the same text be formally read in many different ways, depending on the reading practices of the time, the reader, and the ways in which the text is maybe presented, whether it's on a scrap of paper lying around or in a book of poetry bound up in a particular way? Do all of these things kind of influence how a text is also read and how this text is formed kind of in terms of its identity and in its form?
Mm. Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. So let me give a kind of wonderful example, which it's a very well-known, it's one of the most well-known medieval lyrics, although probably the most well-known song is Summer is a Coming In, but I won't talk about that just at the minute. But there is a song or a piece called Now Goeth Sonne under Ward, which means now goes the sun under the forest, under the tree. There's lots of possible puns. So that it's about the sun sinking, it's the sunset. And it's just 4 lines. In fact, it's just 23 different words, 23 words altogether. And many of them are repeated. It's very patent. And it had this kind of function in the 70s when new criticism was really powerful and in some ways still is, of being the kind of poster child of a medieval lyric that was a new critical lyric. And this is, if you like, this is the best that medieval English lyrics could offer because it was like, what one thought a lyric should be. Now, if you go back to the manuscripts, you find that it is this little English quatrain, but in fact, it's not on its own, kind of naked and shivering on a white page, as many lyrics are now. It's part of a religious treatise composed by St. Edmund of Abingdon. And the original treatise is very long. It's about many things, but including the Passion, the Crucifixion. And it's written in Latin, but it also in French, and there were many English translations. And in fact, there are 80 manuscripts of this work. And they all have this English, as I haven't checked every single one. I'm probably up to about 55 by now. But they're hard to track down. And there's this little English quatrain, and then you read it in context, and you find that it's a beautiful story again, narrative, because the Edmund has written it. It's in French and it's in Latin, and then finally it's in English. And what he says is, there's Naomi, so it's a story of Ruth, and Naomi was actually from modern Palestine, interestingly enough, from Moab. And her husband and her two sons all die. One of her daughters-in-law says, "I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to stay with you." And this is Ruth. And so they go back to Naomi's birthplace, which was actually in Jerusalem, sorry, Bethlehem. And Ruth arranges quite cunningly for Naomi to marry a local wealthy businessman. And so they get established and are there together, back as exiles or just having lived in different places back to Bethlehem. And Ruth then becomes a local Jewish wife. And eventually there's a kind of lineage to David and then to Jesus, born later. But what happens is that Naomi is quoted as being full of bitterness, full of tears, because she's had such a hard life. She's lost her husband, everything. Um, and then there's another quotation from the female speaker in the Song of Songs who says, my face is discolored from the sun. I'm sunburned. And then comes this English quatrain, and it's extraordinary because it's all about the sun, it's all about the sun setting. She says, my face, the speaker, Mary, now says, my face is discolored. And it's partly from weeping, it's partly from the pun on son, which is her son is on the cross. What bitter pain she's suffering. So it's very, very sophisticated. And none of this is
Mm.
known to, or talked about if you just treat this as an English poem, just to four lines. It's brilliant in those ways, but there's so much to add to it, so much that enriches it from these different languages, from these different cultures, and it ends up in English. And actually, what's really weird is that it moves gender. So there are these two female speakers, and then it is a female speaker, but Edmund is speaking to his own monks in the monastery. So he's saying, learn to be like Mary, like these female speakers, learn to suffer, to understand their suffering, and to express it in these poignant ways. So the whole thing is just extraordinary. And that's what I would argue is, so what are we left with in terms of lyric? Well, in fact, yes, many things to do with passion, with subjectivity, with the self, with family, with all kinds of things. It's not a million miles away from what we might think lyric to be, but at the same time, it is because it's so multilingual, it's so culture crossing, it's so cumulative in its emotion. So there you are. That's a very interesting example. There are many other examples which are very different and not as full of puns and so on, but they also are linking to these different kinds of, passionate experience.
Definitely. It sounds like if you don't have access to one of these perspectives, you risking not unlocking a massive piece of the text, right? Like if we don't have knowledge of these other poems and these other cultural links, the text becomes, half full of life rather than full of so many meanings in a way.
That's such a beautiful way of putting it. Yes. I'll see if I can get that into my introduction.
I would love that. Yes, so I would also love to incorporate now the topic of music a bit into our
Hmm.
discussion, which I think we already have kind of touched on a little bit. And I'd love to chat a bit about your book, Poetry and Music in Medieval France, published by Cambridge University Press. So this book is amazing, and it focuses on vernacular song in medieval France. So can you please give us a bit of a brief background on what vernacular song is, first of all, how it differs from any music that may have preceded it, and why it is so important to mark vernacular song's emergence in history specifically?
Yes, actually, quite complex questions. Often, often the kind of starting point questions are really hard to answer because you don't have all the information. On the other hand, yes, so lots of different strands. Um, Vernacular. So the most important language, of course, throughout the Middle Ages was Latin. So when we think of vernacular, in some ways we're thinking of the less well-educated people, and of course there's always been song. There's always been song that less well-educated people, or people who were not educated in Latin but in history, who didn't necessarily learn to write. They may have been very educated and knew a great deal, and still now that is the case, but they're not necessarily attached to learning that in a written form. They might learn it orally, they might learn it from, and that, in a way, that's true now, even more so than ever, because our education is so visual, so oral. You don't actually have to read vast amounts unless you're a student. People don't. They want to again, but it's amazing how much of everyday life is not actually anymore about reading words. It's really about picking up information in these extra literary ways. So there's different factors there. One is that Latin is the language you learn if you learn to write and read throughout most of the Middle Ages. And that's what language is by definition, therefore. You don't think of a vernacular language necessarily as vernacular until much later. In fact, the earliest speakers of French and Italian and Spanish thought they were speaking Latin, right? Because that was what the definition of a language was, so say. And later people started to think of vernacular as vernacular. So in terms of music, the so much of what was vernacular song has just not survived because it was never written down. And indeed, again now, as I was talking about African American music, so much of it is not written down. Huge amounts are not written down. And you think of modern jazz, so many of the subtleties indeed of song and of jazz, they were never written down. They are never written down. They're part of what you do in the performance. So the earliest stages of vernacular song, the only ones we can ever know are the ones that were written down because that's how it survived. We wouldn't know about them otherwise, and we don't know about them otherwise. Um, what older scholars wanted to discover was the origins of vernacular song. So they were always looking for, here's a piece of writing that is a kind of remnant of what was known, popular by the people. We don't think of it in that way anymore. It's a little bit patronizing. But at the same time, there is a kind of fascination with different types of music that people engaged in. And so Latin music was all about the church, was all about chant, was all about the Bible, about the liturgy. As the Middle Ages, well, as time went by, as it were, um, and more people had access to writing, and writing became more aspirational for the middle classes, essentially. Then different kinds of Latin genres were also very common, and some of them are very obscene. They're like students writing songs completely different from the chant they were singing every day, and those survive. They're just not read that much, and so there's a vast amount of Latin song that's not pious, put it that way, not religious, and would make your eyes water even now in terms of wow, okay. um, and so, yeah, long story short, the vernacular song that I was really interested in was French vernacular song in the 13th century. And the chansonniers, as I described, they're so attractive. But as a literary person as well, as an English and French literary person, it's also fascinating to discover that many of these vernacular songs were also copied, in fact, were first copied in romances, in narratives, not in these chansonniers. So, but not necessarily with music, sometimes with music, sometimes not. So there's this fascinating way in which song gets written down by people who are writing narrative stories about people singing, right? And so here is a character, here's the hero of this romance, here's the heroine of this romance, And this is the song they sang at this point. Um, and sometimes music is there, sometimes it's not there, because the assumption is if you know this song, you know the music in your memory. You don't need to write it down. Eventually, people do write it down. But I was totally interested in this world of romance, of narrative, mostly aristocrats, mostly some of them aristocrats pretending in a Marie Antoinette way to be, peasants, shepherd girls, shepherdesses, that kind of thing, and dressing up and performing these songs. So it's a fascinating world, and some of them, are reflecting a real world of the aristocrats playing around like this. Um, and so you are getting a kind of glimpse into real life, as well as if you like, a real life that's full of fantasy. Yeah, so these are people enjoying themselves, entertainment, like we have entertainment now. The romance now as a genre is all about fantasy, so many ways. But it's also real life. This is real. Many of us now spend a real life involved in fantasy. So you get this kind of doubleness going on. And then the songs themselves are, but you get those from the chansonnier where they're written down in music. They're beautiful, they're astonishing, they're complicated, they're fascinating. And so I wanted to talk about that interplay between a narrative and the songs that people were singing and how that connected. Why would you want to be the heroine in your own narrative as a singer? And of course, people think, well, there's opera, it's a bit like that. It's also not like opera because it's easier in a funny kind of way. It's like, it's not the whole thing, it's not sung. You've got a narrative to read, and then you pause for a song. So there's all kinds of fascination. But yeah, from the scholarly point of view, it was important to point out to musicologists who basically don't, they're interested in the music. They're interested in the music primarily, not in the words as poems and in the narratives as historical context for how people might have performed. But I was saying, you know what? If you do look at these, you find that these are the first places that people are writing down song. So we need to kind of look at them and think of them. And I guess I was trying to encourage this perspective on song where it's not just about the music and it's not just about the words, as literary people tend, they kind of ignore the music. It's too complicated, it's scary, especially if I have to read it. Reading music is still a specialized activity. So I'm there trying to say it's both kind of obviously, but at the same time, not obviously now in an academic circle where the one is kind of privileging the other. So it is fascinating, but again, it's a and, it's a both and, not a one or the other. Let's try and do both. Medieval music is complicated to learn. The written form of it, it's easy enough to memorize wonderfully. You don't have to read the notation to perform it beautifully, but reading the notation is a lot of hard work, especially for literary people. So it's not wrong to say that there are barriers, and so I spend a lot of my time trying to break those barriers down, not always succeeding.
No, that is absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for that background. And it's really interesting, I think, the idea of balancing the literary with the musical, because I do think that those worlds are often so separate, and there's not a lot of crossover because music is written almost in its own language. And if you don't have access to that language, a lot of people think, well, I guess I can't really understand music. But I think you're right. Like there is such a literary aspect to song as well, because song in its own way is telling a story through the English language, often through lyric and through lyrics written, to the music. Which leads me to my next question, actually, about this kind of interdisciplinary aspect to your work. So, what is it like negotiating these two kind of different, like one might say, art forms, one of which has that oral component and the other does not? How do you bridge music and literature? And is it ever challenging to do so when these art forms sometimes don't share all of the same components or building blocks or aspects, like music has that oral component where literature does not? But music also shares the written component with literature. So it's almost like music has an extra moving part that literature doesn't have. But also, I was thinking about this a few days ago when I was reading actually about your work. Um, I was thinking that it almost reminds me of learning a new language, um, like a foreign language, where a lot of this learning for young children, especially who are multilingual, is done but by the ear rather than by the written word. So you learn orally instead of learning, literarily, like in a classroom or something like this. Um, and I think when I'm looking at music and thinking about, studying musical works, as you were saying, a lot of these songs didn't have a literary component to them. They were just passed down orally. And I think these people must have thought that they would never become lost to history, because who thinks
Mm.
about our lives becoming lost to history? It's quite a morbid thought. So I think no one really is considering that when they're thinking about preserving things that we're doing every day. But I just find that kind of oral aspect of learning really interesting, because it is something literature sometimes doesn't have all the way, in terms of the oral being a primary way of understanding literature. Many poets, I think, might say that no, my poems need to be read out loud. The oral aspect is just as important. But I think the public in our society, we don't hold that oral aspect as primary as the written aspect, whereas in music it is as primary. So I'm wondering kind of how you bridge those two, and like kind of your thoughts on this topic.
Yes,
Yes,
it's fascinating again, and I think sometimes there's a difference between, academic kind of approaches and non-academic approaches, and yeah, my two children had the misfortune to be the product of two academic parents, and it's very good to get that sense of the whole of world is not academic necessarily. And so I think some of this is the kind of problem caused by academic disciplines. So musicology and literary studies are two different things. And people will make their choices on that basis. So I'm really a literary person, so that's why I'm studying literature. I'm really interested in the music, so that's why I'm going to be a musicologist. Um, but actually, in real life, which I don't like making that distinction, but um, people, of course, are interested in songs. All people, it seems, are interested in songs, and they're fascinated by that connection between the words and the music. They may know both very, very well, or they may know the tune better than the words, or vice versa. But there is this immediate sense that a song has got to be both, right? It's got to be music and a poem, if we use that term, then again, we've learned down the centuries to read silently, to read everything silently. It's a kind of mark of sophistication, intellectualism. I read silently. I wouldn't read it aloud because that would make me sound like a child learning, you know b, s, instead of being able to, that skill, being able to read to yourself silently. But actually, this is one of the great things that I talk about, in classes or whatever. I have a class called Medieval Songlines, which has been working with my draft edition and is also, writing a book on this, where people come who from all backgrounds. So there may be biologists, there may be music majors, English majors, of course, French majors, whoever, anybody, mathematicians. And some of them are really primarily interested in the music, especially the biologists, perhaps, or have always wanted to read literature, but never really have. And what we grasp about the medieval literature is that it is all about performance, in fact. It's all about speaking it aloud or uttering it aloud, if you want to call it performing it in some way. Doesn't mean to say people didn't read silently, but the majority of people, the word and the note were part of your oral experience in daily life, just as they are now. So it is a kind of distinction between academic life, which is rarely about performing aloud, um, and the kind of daily life, which is very much about listening and speaking and performing. So that's partly what's going on. And one of the music students, music majors in one of my classes, he was so performative, such a great person. He was a conductor, in fact, and couldn't stop himself from thinking about music actively all the time. And he loved performing Middle English. He knew no Middle English at the start of the course. And he performed it stunningly. Of course, I don't know how to pronounce Middle English. I wasn't born then either. But, I have some idea of how it might have been. And it just enlivened the whole atmosphere every time he said, I want to read it out, and he would. And everybody enjoyed it. Some people, the more literary people, were a bit scared, how will I sound? He wasn't in the least scared. He's a performer. So it was very good to get those elements as part of the world of approaching medieval song. And as I say, a lot of it is kind of getting rid of some of that high art inhibition. And some of it, I'm not saying it's not sophisticated, though. That's the problem that we have. We equate the sophisticated with the literate all the time. And it's if you can break that equation, then a whole world is open to you. And again, it's about connecting with contemporary song, contemporary poetry. We have lots of contemporary artists, poets, all sorts of people at my institution at Yale, and they're fascinating. They're doing performance poetry all the time. That's what's happening. So it's a great connection. Hip hop, frankly, I'm not an expert at all on hip hop. Luckily, one of my children is. So I try not to embarrass myself too much by pretending knowledge I don't have, but I'm fascinated by the ways in which there are connections between, what looks like written word, but is actually entirely about hearing rhymes,
Mm.
rhythms, sounds, in really intense and subtle ways. So that we have lots to talk about in these ways. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. And I think so this kind of topic I think connects very much to your chapter vernacular poetry and music, which you wrote for the Cambridge Companion to medieval music. And you make a really interesting observation in this chapter when you say, quote, the oral version of a song is always going to be different from its written version, which I think is really interesting. And you continue, you write, quote, the act of writing down a song probably bears more relation to the act of writing down a play or a piece of poetry than to the activities of singing or speaking. It is the activity of writing itself, in other words, that helps to make a work literary. So I think that quote is so precise and so well said, and I think it's very true. I find it really interesting to kind of pull that out, and to kind of think about what makes a work, first of all, literary, and second of all, different from another kind of work or activity. And I think often we might think that no, definitely a written piece of music is more similar to the act of someone singing or a filmed performance of someone singing. The written piece is more, it bears more similarity to a video of the song being performed. When
Mm.
actually we might second guess that and say, no, actually the written portion bears more similarity to another written portion. For example, this poem right here. Um, and I think that's really interesting because in that way, you're very much cutting across different disciplines and saying, no, this written piece of music is actually more similar to a written piece of literature than it is to a performance of music, which is essentially the same discipline.
Mm.
So the fleeting nature of the oral aspect, I think, to a singular musical performance lies in a kind of juxtaposition to the permanence of words on a page, which I think
Mm.
might be connected to this topic. So can you tell us a bit more about your thoughts on this?
Mm.
And how did you reconcile these differences in your own research process for,
Mm.
for these various books, but also when thinking about music and literature and how they relate more generally?
Mm. Yes. I mean, you'll have noticed one interesting example of that is writing for a companion to medieval music and writing for a companion to medieval literature. And in fact, I've written both, but of course, the audiences really are a bit different. And I stubbornly try to write for the other audience as well each time. Um, but yeah, I think. writing, pervades, of course, despite what I've just said, of course, we live in an oral world, but also writing is hugely important to our sense of our current contemporary sense of intellectual credibility. You can't, you don't want to admit that you're illiterate, as it were. It's a bad word. And people use it in the Middle Ages as many people are illiterate, as in a kind of patronizing way, and having to unlearn that it doesn't mean not, not clever or not intellectual. It means not having access to writing. Now we assume everybody must, in an ideal world, have access to writing. It's absolute mantra. And I wouldn't disagree in any way at all. But I think, again, if one can understand that writing is, if you like, it's again understanding that writing doesn't define intellectual activity or even, the act of writing, as if you couldn't think about topics, couldn't be a philosopher, couldn't be a historian, couldn't be a musicologist, couldn't be a literary person if you didn't know how to read or write. In our modern world, that's kind of true, but it's also, we're learning that in many cultures, it's not as simple as that. And part of it, we know that through languages. So there's this huge desire to speak English, to read English, to write English all over the world. It's not actually the most common language that everybody knows. It's the language that people desire to learn. So again, I'm trying to kind of think beyond some of these assumptions that we completely take for granted as educators, but also as students, at whatever age, people who want to learn. And the interesting thing about music is that it forces you back on performance in a way that the literary doesn't. It's perfectly possible to read silently and get a brilliant kind of absorption of literature from any period that survives in that form. And I should say, I love poetry from all periods. I'm very engaged in all kinds of things. But music, there's a funny kind of way in which the writing is, it reminds you every time, this is not music. It's silent by definition, right? This is not music. The music only exists in sound, in performance. And this is, if you like, totally obvious, but we also forget it because writing is such an obvious desire for us that we forget that the written is not at all part of music necessarily. It's our only way of understanding music from the past. So pre-recordings of music, we have no idea what anything sounded like by definition. We only have the written form. So it's vital for us looking back, but it's still, ironically, not telling you anything about music. So I think that's a very good salutary observation to take back into other fields, because it reminds you that writing is it's a separate and not necessarily identical activity to forms. Of course it isn't, we know that. But if you look at a piece of writing, again, as a poem in any earlier period pretty well, and this also goes for the Romantics and post-Romantics, you would read out your poetry. The Victorians loved having evenings where people read aloud and sang and performed in the home music, piano, arrangements and so on. And it's very recently that we've assumed that the intellectual world is silent. So in some ways, I think, connecting up with different disciplines through understanding, if you like, the partial nature of writing for intellectual life it's a good thing to learn. It's a good thing. It opens oneself up to all kinds of ways of thinking that are not bound by the written.
Definitely. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about poetry and about how when you have access to a piece of poetry, it's almost like on a page. It's almost like you have access to this other world where, if you can read what the words on the page, you can read it aloud with your voice if you wanted to. And you could, you kind of could try to understand how the poem sounds orally as well, sounding out the beats and the tempo and such, and seeing, oh, maybe it's meant to be read like this. And in turn, you can kind of unlock another world from that oral component. But if you can't read music, you can't really do that. You can't really unlock that aural component when you're looking at sheet music. If you can't read the sheet music, it's almost like it's written in a secret language.
Absolutely.
So how would you reconcile that? I was just thinking, if someone can't read sheet music,
Mm.
are they, I don't know, are they missing? I mean, they are missing this whole other world that arises from the words on the page, essentially, because you can't decipher them, you know?
Yeah, well, in our contemporary world, most people, in fact, can't read the sheet music, right? Or
Definitely.
are not interested in. They may have learned painfully at school how to read music, but it's not really part of their lives. And so, how do we pick it up? Orally, by memory. It's blasted out from all kinds of musical source. You just have to walk into a department store, and so much music is out there in the public sphere. And how do we pick it up? Through our memories. That is the essential thing. So, in a funny kind of way, you don't need to read music, and that's really what I'm saying. And so you're not. I think you're not missing out a lot in the modern world. You are if you are really want to study music, especially from the past, or music that is more complex, or just in an idiom that you're not used to. So, especially, there is some music you can't sing, music polyphony, orchestral music. You can't sing all those parts at once. But you can learn it by hearing it, and the more you train, the conductors can hear every single part, 26, 46 parts in an orchestral score. You can hear those if you're trained. Um, and most people can't. So training will get you to places always that you can't achieve on your own, and that's what universities are for. And they're wonderful places for that purpose. But I'm also saying, we don't have to despair if or rather, there's many positives to understanding that there are many ways of learning. And if you add again these different strands of education, of training, you gain so much. But yeah, no, that's really what I mean about music. That reading, of course, it's. I mean, I couldn't function with that if I couldn't read as a person, and that's something I've learned from the earliest days. So many of us are like that. Um, but at the same time, learning, and one can train oneself to read better, to read more concentratedly, to notice more. A lot of it's about observation, training yourself to just see more, understand more. From after that first quick glance, pause, concentrate, think, imagine. All of these pausing, slow processes teach you more and more. But you don't have to think that the writing is the key to everything. It's a key to a lot. But if you miss out on the performance side of things, again, you're missing a great deal. Um, I don't
That
think
is
the
really
answer to your question, but it's partly, yeah. I mean, it's also that our modern disciplines do separate things out, and I'm never going to turn to molecular biology, alas, because I should have done all that maths and education, between 18 and now, to manage it. It's pretty well impossible to start again now. I guess I almost possibly could if I really, really, really did nothing else. But um, so there are these disciplines. It is that is another language. There's no way I could read a paper
very true.
and really understand it now in a deeply scientific journal where the language is very compressed, symbolic in many ways. And um, people might feel that about Middle English. It's not that hard. You just have to kind of focus on it. It's no harder than focusing on a physics paper necessarily. But it is, there are genuine disciplinary boundaries, but there are also ways of connecting, talking. And I guess as an interdisciplinary person, I'm fascinated by the possibilities of connection across two disciplines that never realized that there were possibilities of connection. But I'm also, the reason why it's interesting is because that very gap, that very sense of barrier, if you fight through it, as it were, that's when you start kind of thinking original thoughts, noticing things that you wouldn't have thought otherwise. So it's a kind of double activity. It's recognizing that there's a massive difference of perspective, approach, maybe skill. But there's also, if you put the two together, then new things emerge. And I've spent a lot of hours, with music and with musical notation that many of my literary colleagues would never want to do, right? Fair enough, it's fine. So there is a lot of work involved. And sometimes I feel like there's not been enough of me to do three disciplinary, kind of activities at that kind of level. It's really hard work to read that much French medieval literature, that much English medieval literature, that much study, that much music. So it's a lot of work. And that's
It's
also a
amazing.
message to the graduate students that, you know, the interdisciplinary world is not, it's not, just, it's not a ball in terms of amount of work, but it is fantastic once you start making connections that you could not have made without putting that work in.
Definitely. I think when two disciplines overlap, such beautiful things kind of arise out of that because of the unusual nature of two disciplines coming together. Because they are different disciplines. So when they have those intersection points, amazing things happen. I'm even thinking of things like performance art that kind of bridges visual art with
Yes,
literature,
yeah, yeah.
is very similar, and also as you were speaking about different disciplines having different components to their structure. I was also thinking about plays and how plays have that written aspect and they also have that performance aspect. And
Yes.
I know, many people actually choose to be performance scholars and think about staging, think about costumes, think about, can you make a feminist staging of one text versus a traditional staging of the exact same text. So even things like that, they interact with the written word in such interesting ways. But I
Mm.
think you're completely right when you have interdisciplinary, research projects or interdisciplinary work. You have to reconcile the differences as well as the similarities, which makes it very tough and very complicated, but also very fruitful because you're
Yeah.
making new connections across two disciplines, or three in your case, with history as well. So, no, definitely. So I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. I
Oh, so
really enjoyed.
welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone listening has learned so much as well, just as I have. My kind of closing question for you, I guess, is do you have any advice for young scholars who are maybe beginning to research medieval lyric or the
Yeah.
relationship between literature, music, and history, or anything similar of that nature? Do you have any advice for these people?
Well, um, I sometimes feel that, giving advice is exactly what one shouldn't do because, unless unsolicited advice is never, never welcome. But you've asked me, and people do ask me. So, I don't know. I think don't assume that medieval is a hard, backward, um, unsophisticated. Don't assume that. Um, there will be hard work involved, but there is hard work in any subject. Any subject. It's no harder, really. Um, but it is good to be interested in languages. It is good to be interested in the visual. I haven't even mentioned the visual, but medieval culture was extraordinarily visual, hence these stunning manuscripts that the wealthy were able to commission, and much more, again, than modern high art. I mean, apart from art, but if I'm talking about literature, high art literature, the visual is almost frowned on because it's like, oh, that's for a coffee table audience, right? Or even a children's book audience. Not the case. But I think I would say, don't be discouraged at the beginning, especially like with learning languages, any language. If one is learning a language, there's a certain amount of just work you have to do, and then there's a breakthrough, and it's like, after that breakthrough, worlds open to you, and it's like learning to read at all. There's a process, and then, you're in this magical environment. So there is a bit of learning to do, but I think I would also just say, there are so many, you don't have to change yourself, I mean, be imaginative, be imaginative about the past. I think for me that was crucial. I'm fascinated by the past. I just am. Not everybody is, but I just am, and I'm fascinated, I think, as well by how do I appreciate the past, given that I'm a contemporary person. You know, I'm never going to get back there. I'm never going to be a 14th century Londoner, um, or 14th century Cambridge student or whatever. I'm a now student. I'm a now person. So I'm really interested in that process of how do we understand history? How do we understand the past? So I guess having that intellectual interest in the past is also pretty vital. But a lot of people are also fascinated by medievalism, if you like, how we are still kind of using medieval images, music, words, anything, in our present kind of contemporary world. So, you know, Cambridge and Yale are interesting comparisons in that way, because Cambridge is the real medieval architecture mostly, but of course mixed in with lots of modern architecture. And Yale is, 20th, 19th, and 20th century medieval. But that is also fascinating too. It's like, why do people keep harking back and making it present? From so many hundred years ago. And there's so many films that are kind of based on medieval topics. There's so much, there's lots of ways in which people are also studying that. So there are many routes to studying the medieval. Some of them are right now, and some of them are going back in time, to that past, and trying to kind of, it's like this imaginative question. How can I think myself? How can I imagine myself back 400, 600, 800 years, to a different time, without kind of indulging in all the cliches that, like the Monty Python is so brilliant, but it's like perpetuated this notion of everybody walked around in mud and carry crosses and wore dark hoods, and not everybody did, believe it or not. So it's also kind of freeing oneself from certain assumptions. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I think that's brilliant advice. And I think you're completely right. Like, there is a certain fascination with wanting to go back to the shared past of mankind, of the globe. And that nostalgic kind of yearning for something that never was. We obviously never touch these time periods physically, but we have such access to them through these, many various disciplines, literature, music, historical studies, whatever it may be, art, as you were saying, with manuscript studies. There definitely is, I think, a fascination with the past. And, the medieval period is one of the first originators of all of this various culture and various visual art, various music and literature. So I think it's amazing to kind of to go back to that through your work. So yeah, thank you again so much for talking to me. I massively enjoyed it. And I hope you have a brilliant rest of the day, and as well, happy holidays. So yeah.
Yes, same to you, and happy holidays to you. And it's been such fun talking to you. Thank you for your questions.